In the early 1990s, there was a country in Europe where people had grown up together. They went to the same schools. They worked the same jobs. They lived side by side, without thinking much about their differences. Then, in a short span of time, everything began to change. The country started to fall apart. Borders that had never mattered suddenly did. Politics shifted. Trust began to break. And places that once felt ordinary slowly became part of something uncertain. The wars that followed were not fought in distant lands. They happened in towns and cities where life had once been shared. In the closing years of the 20th century, the country known as Yugoslavia stood at a quiet but uncertain turning point. For decades, it had existed as a single state made up of several republics, each with its own history, culture, and identity. These regions had been brought together after the First World War and later reorganized after the Second World War into a socialist federation. For a long time, despite differences beneath the surface, the country had remained relatively stable. Yugoslavia was not a simple or uniform nation. It included Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Slovenes, Macedonians, and others, each with distinct languages, religions, and traditions. Some communities were primarily Orthodox Christian, others Catholic, and others Muslim. These differences had existed for centuries, shaped by earlier empires such as the Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Yet for much of the 20th century, they were held together within a single political system. A key figure in maintaining this balance was Josip Broz Tito, the leader of Yugoslavia after the Second World War. Under his leadership, the country followed a unique path, separate from both the Soviet Union and Western powers. Tito's government emphasized unity among the different national groups, while also allowing a degree of autonomy to the republics within the federation. For many years, this system helped prevent serious conflict. Although tensions did not disappear, they were managed within the structure of the economic development. Shared institutions and a strong central authority created a sense of stability that lasted for decades. However, this balance depended heavily on Tito's leadership. When he died in 1980, the system he had built began to face increasing strain. Without a single unifying figure, political power became more divided, and the different republics started to assert their own interests more openly. At the same time, economic problems began to grow. Yugoslavia faced rising debt, inflation, and unemployment. These challenges affected everyday life and contributed to a sense of uncertainty about the future. As economic conditions worsened, political tensions between the republics also increased. During the late 1980s, nationalist ideas began to gain more influence in several parts of the country. Political leaders in different republics started emphasizing their own national identities and interests. In some cases, this meant questioning the value of remaining within a single federal state. One of the most important developments during this period was the rise of Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia. He promoted a stronger role for Serbia within Yugoslavia and appealed to nationalist sentiments among Serbs. His policies and speeches increased tensions with other republics, particularly those that feared growing Serbian influence. At the same time, leaders in Slovenia and Croatia began moving in a different direction. They favored greater independence and economic reform, and they were less willing to accept centralized control from Belgrade. Political discussions that had once taken place within a shared system were becoming more confrontational. By the early 1990s, the situation had reached a critical point. Several republics began to consider the possibility of leaving Yugoslavia altogether. Elections were held in different regions, and new governments came to power with mandates that reflected growing nationalist sentiment. In 1991, Slovenia and Croatia declared independence from Yugoslavia. These decisions marked the beginning of a major transformation in the region. What had once been a single country was now starting to break apart. The response from the federal government and the Yugoslav People's Army was immediate. In Slovenia, a brief conflict followed, often referred to as the 10-Day War. Compared to what would come later, this conflict was relatively short and limited, but it signaled that the breakup of Yugoslavia would not be peaceful. In Croatia, the situation became far more complex and prolonged. Areas with significant Serb populations became centers of tension, and fighting broke out between Croatian forces and Serb groups, often with the involvement of the Yugoslav army. Towns and cities that had once been part of a shared state now became front lines in a growing conflict. As the violence spread, it became clear that the disintegration of Yugoslavia would involve not just political change, but also armed conflict. The wars that followed would reshape the region, affect millions of people, and leave a lasting impact on the history of Europe. The early stages of the Yugoslav Wars were marked by uncertainty and rapid change. Borders were no longer fixed. Alliances shifted, and communities that had lived together for generations found themselves divided by new lines of conflict. What had once been a single country was now entering a period of fragmentation and war, the full consequences of which were only beginning to unfold. As Yugoslavia began to break apart in 1991, the initial conflicts revealed how complex and fragile the situation had become. While Slovenia's brief war ended relatively quickly, the fighting in Croatia developed into a much longer and more difficult struggle. The reasons for this lay not only in politics, but also in the mixed populations living across the region. Within Croatia, there were areas where large numbers of ethnic Serbs lived, particularly in regions such as Krajina. As Croatia moved toward independence, many of these communities feared becoming part of a new state where they might lose political influence or face uncertainty about their future. Local Serb leaders, supported in various ways by authorities in Serbia, began organizing their own structures and resisting Croatian control. This created a situation where the conflict was not simply between two clearly separated sides. Instead, it developed across towns, villages, and regions where different communities lived close to one another. Lines of control were often unclear, and the front lines shifted as the war progressed. The Yugoslav People's Army, which had once represented the unified military of the Federation, became increasingly involved in the conflict. Although it was officially a federal force, its actions in Croatia were often seen as supporting Serb positions. This further complicated the situation and contributed to the escalation of violence. As fighting intensified, different types of military forces began to appear. In addition to regular armies, various paramilitary groups formed on multiple sides. These groups were often less structured than traditional military units and sometimes operated independently, adding another layer of unpredictability to the conflict. The nature of the war also began to change. Instead of short engagements or clearly defined battles, many areas experienced prolonged fighting. Towns and cities became key targets, and control over specific locations gained importance. Roads, bridges, and supply routes were contested, as each side attempted to maintain access to resources and communication. One of the defining features of this stage of the war was the emergence of siege warfare. In several places, forces surrounded towns and cut them off from supplies, electricity, and communication. These sieges could last for extended periods, affecting not only soldiers, but also large numbers of civilians living inside the affected areas. Among the most well-known examples was the siege of Vukovar in eastern Croatia. The city became the focus of intense fighting in 1991 as Yugoslav army forces and Serb units attempted to take control. The battle lasted for weeks, and much of the city was heavily damaged. Conditions inside became increasingly difficult as supplies ran low and infrastructure was destroyed. When the fighting in Vukovar finally ended, the extent of the destruction became widely known. The battle came to symbolize the scale and seriousness of the conflict in Croatia and drew international attention to the war. Elsewhere, similar patterns began to appear. Towns were contested, populations displaced, and daily life was disrupted across large areas. Civilians often found themselves caught in situations where the front lines shifted around them, making it difficult to leave or find safety. As the conflict continued, the international community began to respond more actively. Diplomatic efforts were made to bring about ceasefires and negotiations, while humanitarian organizations worked to provide assistance to affected populations. However, achieving a lasting agreement proved difficult, as the positions of the different sides remained far apart. By early 1992, the war in Croatia had already caused significant changes. Areas of the country were effectively divided, with different regions under the control of different groups. Although ceasefire agreements were reached at various points, they were often fragile and did not fully stop the fighting. At the same time, the situation in another part of Yugoslavia was becoming increasingly tense. Bosnia and Herzegovina, one of the most diverse republics in the Federation, was now facing many of the same pressures that had led to conflict elsewhere. Bosnia's population included Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats, all living across the same territory. As political changes unfolded, different groups within Bosnia began to form their own positions about the future of the republic. Some supported independence, while others preferred to remain connected to a larger Yugoslav or Serbian framework. The complexity of Bosnia's population made the situation especially delicate. Unlike in some other areas, communities were often closely mixed, with no clear divisions between regions. This meant that any conflict would likely affect a wide range of people and places. By the time 1992 approached, it was becoming clear that the breakup of Yugoslavia was far from over. The conflict in Croatia had already shown how quickly tensions could turn into prolonged war, and the conditions in Bosnia suggested that an even more complicated situation might soon develop. The events of the coming months would expand the conflict further, drawing in new regions and deepening the challenges faced by those living through this period. What had begun as the disintegration of a single state was now turning into a series of interconnected wars, each shaped by its own local conditions, but linked by a common history. The story of the Yugoslav Wars was moving into a new phase, one that would become more widespread and more difficult to resolve. As the conflict in Croatia settled into an uneasy and incomplete ceasefire during early 1992, attention increasingly shifted toward Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the situation was becoming more uncertain with each passing month. Unlike Slovenia or even Croatia, Bosnia was not defined by a clear majority of one group. Instead, it was a deeply mixed society where Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats lived across the same towns, cities, and rural areas, often side by side. This diversity had long been part of Bosnia's character, but in the context of a collapsing federation, it made political decisions far more complicated. As other republics moved toward independence, Bosnia faced a difficult question about its own future. Different communities within the republic held different views, and these differences were becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile. In early 1992, a referendum was held on whether Bosnia and Herzegovina should become an independent state. Many Bosniaks and Croats supported independence, seeing it as a way to move forward after the breakup of Yugoslavia. However, many Bosnian Serbs opposed the move, preferring to remain within a Yugoslav framework or maintain close ties with Serbia. When the referendum results favored independence, Bosnia and Herzegovina declared itself a sovereign state. This decision marked a turning point. Almost immediately, tensions that had been building began to turn into open conflict. Armed groups formed rapidly, and existing political divisions were reflected on the ground. Bosnian Serb forces, supported in various ways by elements linked to Serbia and the former Yugoslav military, began taking control of territory. At the same time, Bosnian government forces and Croatian units organized their own defenses. The nature of the conflict in Bosnia quickly became complex and difficult to define. Front lines were not always clear, and control of territory often shifted. Cities, towns, and villages that had once been shared spaces became divided, and in many cases, people were forced to leave their homes as the fighting approached. One of the most defining features of the war in Bosnia was the emergence of prolonged sieges, similar to those seen earlier in Croatia, but often on a larger scale. Among these, the siege of Sarajevo became particularly significant. Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, found itself surrounded by forces positioned in the hills around the city. The siege lasted for several years, making it one of the longest in modern history. Life within the city became increasingly difficult as access to supplies was limited and infrastructure was damaged. Despite these challenges, the city continued to function in many ways, with residents adapting to the conditions as best they could. Elsewhere in Bosnia, the conflict continued across multiple regions. Control of territory became a central objective, and different forces sought to establish areas where their authority would be secure. This often led to the displacement of populations, as people moved away from areas where they no longer felt safe or where control had changed. As the war continued, international attention grew. Reports from the region described the scale of the conflict and its impact on civilians. Humanitarian organizations attempted to provide assistance, while diplomatic efforts were made to bring the fighting to an end. The involvement of the international community gradually increased. Peacekeeping forces were deployed in certain areas, and negotiations were held in an attempt to reach agreements between the parties involved. However, these efforts faced many challenges, as the situation on the ground remained complex and positions between the sides were difficult to reconcile. At times, the alliances within the conflict also shifted. Although Bosniaks and Croats had initially cooperated in some areas, tensions later emerged between them, leading to additional fighting. This added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation, as the war no longer followed a single clear pattern. Throughout 1993 and into 1994, the conflict continued with periods of intense fighting followed by temporary pauses. Each attempt at negotiation brought some hope for resolution, but lasting agreements remained difficult to achieve. Meanwhile, the broader political landscape in the region continued to evolve. Croatia consolidated its position, and Serbia faced increasing international pressure. Sanctions and diplomatic isolation began to affect the wider situation, influencing decisions made by leaders involved in the conflict. By the mid-1990s, it was becoming clear that the war in Bosnia could not continue indefinitely without significant consequences for all sides. The scale of destruction, the displacement of populations, and a strain on resources were all contributing to a growing sense that a resolution would eventually be necessary. The Yugoslav Wars had by now become one of the most complex conflicts in Europe since the Second World War. What had begun as the breakup of a single country had turned into multiple overlapping wars, each shaped by local conditions, but connected by shared history and political change. As the conflict moved forward, efforts to bring about a final settlement increased. The coming period would see more direct international involvement and renewed attempts to reach an agreement that could bring an end to the fighting in Bosnia. The outcome of these efforts would determine not only the future of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also the long-term stability of the region as a whole. By the mid-1990s, after several years of conflict, the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina had reached a point where continuing along the same path was becoming increasingly difficult for all sides involved. The fighting had spread across large parts of the country. Front lines had shifted many times, and entire regions had been transformed by the conflict. Cities, towns, and rural areas had all been affected in different ways, and the situation had drawn sustained attention from the international community. Efforts to bring the war to an end had been ongoing for some time, but earlier attempts at negotiation had struggled to produce lasting results. The complexity of the conflict, combined with the number of groups involved and the changing situation on the ground, made it difficult to reach agreements that all sides would accept. During this period, international involvement became more direct. Diplomatic pressure increased, and external actors began playing a more active role in encouraging negotiations. At the same time, military developments also influenced the course of events. Changes in the balance of power on the ground, along with coordinated actions in certain areas, began to shift the situation toward a point where a settlement became more likely. In 1995, a series of intensified efforts brought representatives of the main parties together for negotiations in the United States. These discussions took place at a military base in Dayton, Ohio, where leaders worked through complex issues related to territory, governance, and the future structure of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The negotiations were detailed and often difficult, but over time, an agreement was reached, known as the Dayton Agreement. It formally ended the war in Bosnia in late 1995. The agreement established Bosnia and Herzegovina as a single state, but divided into two main entities, each with a high degree of autonomy. This structure was designed as a way to balance the interests of the different groups while maintaining the country as one recognized nation. The signing of the agreement brought an end to active fighting in Bosnia. International peacekeeping forces were deployed to help implement the terms and maintain stability, and efforts began to rebuild infrastructure and support communities affected by the war. Although the fighting had ended, the effects of the conflict remained visible. Many people had been displaced, and rebuilding both physical structures and social relationships would take time. The war had left a lasting impact on the region, shaping political arrangements and influencing how different communities interacted in the years that followed. At the same time, the broader story of the Yugoslav Wars was not entirely over. In the late 1990s, tensions in another region, Kosovo, began to draw increasing attention. Kosovo, which had been an autonomous province within Serbia, had a majority Albanian population and its own set of political and social tensions. As these tensions grew, conflict developed between Serbian forces and groups seeking greater autonomy or independence for Kosovo. The situation once again attracted international attention, and efforts were made to resolve the conflict through negotiation. When these efforts did not succeed, external involvement increased, including military actions aimed at influencing the situation on the ground. By 1999, the conflict in Kosovo led to further changes in the region, including the establishment of an international presence and new administrative arrangements. With the end of the Kosovo conflict, the series of wars associated with the breakup of Yugoslavia gradually came to a close. What had begun in the early 1990s as the disintegration of a single state had evolved into a complex set of conflicts involving multiple regions, communities, and international actors. In the years that followed, the former republics of Yugoslavia continued on separate paths. Countries such as Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia developed their own political systems and international relationships. Some moved toward integration with European institutions, while others faced ongoing challenges related to governance and economic development. The legacy of the Yugoslav Wars remains significant. The conflicts reshaped the political map of southeastern Europe and influenced the lives of millions of people. They also highlighted the difficulties that can arise when a diverse state undergoes rapid political and economic change without a clear and agreed path forward. Looking back, the Yugoslav Wars were not defined by a single event or a single cause. Instead, they were the result of multiple factors coming together over time, including economic pressures, political change, and the reemergence of national identities within a complex and diverse society. The wars also showed how quickly a period of relative stability can give way to uncertainty when underlying tensions are not fully resolved. What had once been a unified country gradually became a region of independent states, each shaped by the experiences of the 1990s. Today, the Balkans continue to reflect both the challenges and the changes that emerged during that period. While much has been rebuilt and many connections have been restored, the memory of those years remains an important part of the region's history. In the quiet landscapes of cities rebuilt and borders now defined, the legacy of the Yugoslav Wars can still be felt not only in the structures that remain, but also in the lessons they offer about conflict, change, and the complexities of shared history.